Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural lecture in this Barbados Museum and Historical Society series of lectures. My name is Bridget Brereton. I'm a historian attached to the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. And it's my pleasure to be hosting this first lecture. Let me warmly welcome everybody who is following online or on Facebook. We really appreciate your support for this lecture series, for the BMHS, and of course for our first lecturer, Professor Woodville Marshall. As I think you all know, this is the first of 5 lectures which will be aired from today and then every Wednesday throughout the month of May. The sponsors for this lecture series are the BMHS and the Department of History and Philosophy at the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies. And we want to acknowledge support of our sponsors and our partners. Before I introduce our lecturer, you are very welcome to put questions on the Q&A. Of course, you can type up questions throughout the talk, or if you prefer, wait until the end. We will have time for a Q&A session. So let me introduce Professor Woodville Marshall, somebody I have known all my life, I think it's true to say. He taught me as an undergraduate at the Mona campus, and ever since then has been a mentor and a colleague and a friend. As I think everyone knows, he's a very senior historian, particularly a social historian of the Caribbean. And he taught at the University of the West Indies for many, many decades, first at Mona, and then for an even longer stint at Cave Hill. And he held very senior positions in the across campus senior positions. He retired in 2000. His main research interests have been in what you could describe as small communities, small men. He's been interested in sharecroppers, villages, peasantries, and he has published very widely on those topics and others. And I must say, he is also the main man behind the massive book about Barbadian place names, which has been out for a few years, and also the main man in what I hear will be an even more massive dictionary of Barbadian biography, which we are looking forward to. I have to admit to a sense of envy because TNT up to now has nothing comparable to those 2 volumes. Now, even more directly relevant to his talk today, Woodville has been a member of the BMHS ever since 1972, serving on its council until quite recently, 2018. He chaired some of its subcommittees, and in this context, his chief responsibility here was he chaired the government-appointed committee which produced a development plan in 1982. Its aim was to convert the older Barbados Museum into a truly national museum. So he is definitely the appropriate person to kick off this lecture series. And he's going to talk to us. His theme is making a national university. So it's my pleasure to turn over to Woodville Marshall.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Bridget. You make me sound older than I am, but I can live with that, I suppose. I'm happy to have this opportunity to give one of my last lectures, so that I thank the museum for asking me to speak to the topic. Let me begin by making 3 little points. I mean, they're really apologies, I suppose. First of all, the title of this little talk, I call it making a national museum, but on reflection, that was not the right title because I'm not qualified to make a museum. So that the most that you could say is that why I was part of a committee which planned the museum, which planned the conversion of a museum. So making a national museum should probably be amended to make it a plan for a national museum. So that's the first point. The second point that I would like to make is this, that I have been involved, as you've heard, with the museum for a very long time, for nearly 50 years. Well, yeah, I've been a member actually for about 50 years, but I don't regard myself as a museum man. By that I mean that I'm unlikely to be the sort of individual who will justify every action that the Barbados Museum has taken or not taken. So that point, I think, should be stated up front. And thirdly, let me apologize for something. As you would have heard by now, I was a part of the conversion of the Barbados Museum into what seems to be a national museum. So that if, in speaking about that conversion, I seem to be repeating myself, I apologize. But I apologize even more if I seem to be mashing any corns, whether I intended to or not. So please accept my apology for any missteps. So let's get to the subject. I shall briefly take you on a little journey, noticing along the way what has been built and what has been converted. So that, in a sense, I should be looking at what existed after 1933, what has been built, what was built in the 50 years, say by 1970s or the 1980s. And then, of course, I should also look at the conversion of what had been built. And then with the full advantages of hindsight, I shall consider whether there are any clear holes that we can find in that conversion or reconstruction. But before we go any further, we must have a clear point of reference. And I think we can find that point of reference in the nature of the institution that existed from the 1930s, certainly up to the 1980s. And, well, not so much even in that. The point of reference would have to be what we, or some of us, has started to call for a national museum. So our point of reference as we go along to see what happened to the Barbados Museum is to see the extent to which what we had was a national museum, what it did not have as a national museum, and the extent to which it has become a national museum. So in a sense, those are the points that I would like to make in this brief statement. So first of all, therefore, let me define what I mean by a national museum. And this definition comes from a report that was produced in 1978 by a CARICOM workshop on museums monuments and historic sites. And it said this more or less. I quote it quite loosely. And it said this, that each museum shall make the maximum appeal to its own community and can be readily accepted as an educational and cultural force within that community if it does certain things. Its character must be closely related to that of the community itself. And to do this effectively, the museum should, in its exhibits and its services, reflect, and this is the critical statement, reflect in balanced fashion the total history of the locality. And that total history of the locality means, of course, its social, cultural, and industrial manifestation, its natural background and its geology, its flora, its fauna, and economic resources. It follows then that the National Museum, unlike the normal museum, has a close and firm base within the community. And this is represented by the content of its collection and by its active programming inside the community. For these things to happen, and this must be stressed, there must be partnership or collaboration between the people interested in the museum and government. If I might be more specific, and I'm staying with the CARICOM workshop, this is what one would expect. The government should accept the National Museum is an important part of national development and therefore should provide, and the government that is, should provide it with the necessary resources, whether these resources are legislative, administrative, technical, and especially financial, so that a dynamic development program can be launched. Secondly, the government and any existing museum should enlist the assistance of the community in pursuit of its various goals. So therefore, you should have active partnership inside the community. Thirdly, there should be adequate numbers of trained staff. These obviously should be made available in order for that conversion and for that functioning to take place. And finally, the museum's activities should continually feature education in its broadest sense, so that the people who visit, particularly people from the community, can make connections between what they see and themselves. And those activities should have, those activities of the National Museum should have the widest possible scope. Exhibitions, lectures, publications, tapes, films, animation, all of those various means which will allow the museum to reach real people, to make that connection inside the community. We would expect, naturally, that the museum will have its own policy for collecting and conserving materials, that it will conduct archaeological and ethnographic research, and of course, it will store the results of such research, which I suppose you can call those normal museum activities. But really, those, of course, must not be forgotten. So, you could say then we come to our first stop on this journey. So we must ask the first and obvious question. What we here in Barbados had in terms of museum activity by the 1970s and 1980s. Of course, as you must know, we had the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. So let's say we had the Barbados Museum. This institution, founded in 1933, was the home and creation of two groups whose identities are yoked in the name. The Barbados Museum as one section, and the Historical Society as other. Basically, these two groups of individuals were interested in finding a home from which or in which they could prosecute their separate but related interests. One group, that is the civic group, the museum group, they needed a home in which they could house the collection of Reverend Watson, a collection in natural history, mainly shells and fossils, insects, and other natural history specimens. At the same time, the historians, or would-be historians, led by E.M. Shilstone, who himself was an authority on genealogies and antiquities, he had been searching for some time for support in the community for the foundation of a historical society, which will study, as he would put it, which will study and put on permanent record the history of the island, its leading families and public men. You notice they're not, he didn't say women, old buildings, and other antiquarian matters. It is the union of those two groups which becomes the society, the BMH society, which in fact leads immediately to our museum. And you can say that that was a long tradition in Britain and in Europe of learned societies. And by the very name, learned societies, you can deduce the characteristics. Small elite groups with clearly defined intellectual and cultural interests. These groups met, talked, and worked together in order to advance their interests. And it is very clear that the founders of our museum, right from the beginning, were conscious of that tradition, and they duly acknowledged that pedigree, or their pedigree, if I say. For example, they said in the launch of the journal, every learned society and institution, those were their words, has its own organ for the publication of its proceedings. So now there has been no delay in issuing a journal. So one can see the character clearly emerging. The governor of the island was a picture of the society. There were founders, some of the individuals who were called founders. There were full members of the society who had to be elected. There were also associate members who could graduate to full membership status, and a few others as well. But you can see from all of that they were talking small and elite. However, it must be said that the union of the civic circle and the amateur historians had, by the 1970s or 1980s, produced very commendable results, and I shall briefly notice some of them. There had been persistent scholarly work as a result of the creation of this society and the museum. Scholarly work on natural history and in the collection and preservation of specimens and Amerindian artifacts. There had been some solid research and writing on early Barbadian history. There had been collections of coins, stamps, and early West Indian prints. There had been the collection and preservation of books and papers on Barbadian history, particularly of the 17th up to the early 19th century, up to the early 19th century, which of course was the basis for what is now the Shilston Library. There were occasional lectures by local and visiting scholars. There was a children's gallery. There were there was some collection and occasional exhibitions of Barbadian art. And above all, and I would say that as a historian, there was a journal. As I mentioned before, this was an unimpressive achievement, impressive for its content, but also impressive too for its long survival. I mean, it is as old as the society itself. And as I look around our part of the region, it is probably the oldest historical journal. Certainly, when I compare it to Jamaica, it is at least 12 years older than what you could find in Jamaica. So what makes this record that I just briefly outlined commendable is that it was mainly the product of voluntary effort. It is true that government did provide a small subvention and that it did lease the society the premises that it now occupies, at least these premises at a peppercorn rent. But it was the dedicated efforts of a few men and women who staffed the museum, outlined the research priorities, organized exhibitions, edited the journal, and generally ran things. All of one must say, all of the basic work of the museum was done by volunteers and a few paid people. But perhaps most of all, it was the social contacts of those who ran the museum which produced the donations on which the museum mainly existed, and also too produced the content of most of its collections, whether what was produced was Barbadian or not. That is what the museum got. So that these things, these gifts, tended to dominate the museum's collections, and some of the donors, their names grace the rooms in which these collections did appear. So a few questions, linked questions, must follow. If the record was said to be commendable, why and when were questions raised about the role and function of the museum? So let me address the why first. The why questions were raised was presumably an offshoot of that rising self-confidence among non-elite Barbadians who felt that their experiences, their histories, and even their persons should not be marginalized, but should now figure in what was supposed to be a Barbadian institution. In a sense, whether the BMAHS, Barbados Museum and Historical Society, I mean, whether that functioned like the Bridgetown Club or like the Royal Barbados Yacht Club, that was its name then, it is probable that for a long time, those three institutions had been somewhat linked in the consciousness of the mass of Barbadians. And it is also probable that the location of the Barbados Museum, which of course the location did have its advantages, did at the same time deter many because it was perceived as nestling in a socially elite area in the Garrison area. Okay. Moreover, and I am not sure that this counts for anything, I don't recall that any of my contemporaries, secondary school by contemporaries of the 1940s to the 1950s ever mentioned to me that they had visited the Barbados Museum. And for myself, I visited the museum for the first time in 1954 in my last year at secondary school. But I only visited because the chiefs from the University College of the West Indies had scheduled their interviews of potential students at that location. So you see what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that I suspect that most Barbadians, like our political leaders, up until the 70s and the 80s and the 80s, that they may have ignored or shunned the museum because it had no obvious relevance to their life. But I will also suggest as well that set of attitudes might have started to change by the 1970s, probably because of political independence, and probably because of outspoken statements by people like Errol Barrow. The then that might throw some light on the why. And in any case, it is an easier part of the question to answer. The first suggestion that there should be a museum development plan did come from the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. It came in May of 1975. It was then that the council of the museum appointed a small subcommittee to, as they put it, to go into the subject. But for whatever reason, little effort was made to draft such a plan. But what really matters, what put the institution of a national museum on the agenda was the establishment by the government in April 1980 of the National Council on Libraries, Museums, Archives, and Documentation Centers. We call that NACALADS. And one of its terms of reference was to design a national plan for the development and management of museums, archives, and modern records. So this is the point to which we were leading. And it should now be obvious why I call attention to that council that was established and to what report and to the report that that council did render to the government. In particular, one must notice that one of the working parties of that council loudly declared that the Barbados Museum was not a national museum, that a national museum had features that were not present in the Barbados Museum, but also though that the Barbados Museum could be converted into a national museum. And I will quickly quote the recommendation. Barbados should have a national museum, which must reflect the national character, as well as the nation's history, and must be a center for community activity. And the government should prepare and publish a museum development plan and should invite the Barbados Museum and Historical Society to be the instrument for carrying out the government's policy. That was what the working party said. I call attention for a number of reasons. This was the first semi-public statement about the country's need for a national museum. Secondly, the recommendation for a national museum were largely drafted by Peter Campbell, who was then a member of the Council of the Barbados Museum and editor of its journal. I might add too that I was also on that working party. Thirdly, I draw attention to it because the development plan, which was subsequently commissioned by the government, was partly prepared by the same Peter Campbell. And it was a restatement and amplification of what his working party, because he chaired the working party, what his working party had recommended. And finally, I draw your attention because collaboration between the government and the museum was clearly spelled out in as a means of getting the conversion of the existing museum into a national museum. So we come then, therefore, to the museum development plan, and I suppose we come to where we wanted to go. This is the point, the main point of the journey. We can call it the crossroads. It's the time at which the government accepted the recommendation that there should be a museum development plan which would lead to the creation of a national museum. So, in October of 1980, Nigel Barra, who was then the Minister of Information and Culture, set up a small subcommittee, and I will name the small subcommittee. They're all dead, and I'm the only surviving member of that subcommittee. We had Jill Shepard, John Wickham, Ronnie Hughes, Peter Campbell, the same Peter Campbell, the director of the museum, the then director of the museum, and Barbara Hill. All of these people that I said have disappeared. And the permanent secretary, Mr. Chessie Thompson, gave us the remit for the development plan in this way. I write to inform you that my minister is most concerned about the fact that the Barbados Museum is not really representative of the various aspects of the Barbadian life. I am aware that this concern is shared by the president, who has initiated moves to have a plan prepared. The minister is therefore committed to the development of a national museum policy aimed at changing the character of the museum in order to make it truly representative of the history, culture, and development of Barbadian society. To achieve this objective, it is necessary for the future development of the museum. It is necessary that the future development of the museum must be planned. That such a plan should identify and quantify all the various resources necessary for its implementation, as well as for the future operation of the museum as an institution of national development. And he went on, but those were the key points. So, the development plan, the government says a national museum should be created, and that therefore there should be a plan in order to make a conversion of the existing museum into a national museum. So this first development plan, and I must point out, it is the first of several development and strategic plans which were later adopted. This first development plan, however, was finally produced in July of 1982. And it is important to notice it because it set out the lines, or it was the blueprint for the conversion of the existing museum into a national museum. Basically, it examined the character, the collection, and the activities of the existing museum. The plan compared all of these with what was expected of a national museum, as we had defined it earlier. It outlined the deficiencies in the existing operation of the museum. In other words, indicated how it was not a national museum. And here are the key points. It proposed a range of corrective or conversion measures, how all of this should be changed so that it could become a national museum. And it outlined how all of this should be implemented. I will not, of course, bore you with all the details of that plan that was created by the committee. But I must draw your attention to two of the matters, two of the important matters. What we saw, what the small group saw as the deficiencies in the content and the operation of the museum. And secondly, probably more important, the action that should be taken to remedy those deficiencies and therefore make possible the conversion of the existing museum into a national museum. So let me say a little about the deficiencies as we saw them. We found great variety, but also large gaps in the collection, and those large gaps, of course, relate to the important population group, the numerically important population group. This was basic. Because while visitors could learn a great deal about Barbadian planters and merchants, about their lifestyle and their adoption of European material culture, the collection in the museum said little or nothing about the enslaved, about plantation laborers, about peasant farmers and fishermen, about African cultural survivals and folk culture, about vernacular architecture, about house furnishing, cooking and the cooking utensils that you will find there. They said little about traditional crafts and about methods of transportation. In addition, little attention was paid to Jews and Asians, to agriculture and industry, and also to military and maritime history, and even to the creative work of Barbadian artists. So our conclusion, based on what we saw when we looked at the collection, was this. The collection focuses attention mainly on one segment of society and culture, and therefore does not present a coherent or complete story of Barbados in history. That was our conclusion. Of course, it should be said that this could have been a result, or the result, of the almost total dependence on funding and other gifts that were made by patrons. But it is instructive that when a collection fund was started in 1951, the collection or exhibition practices inside the museum were not altered. It is apparent that no gaps were identified, and therefore there were no gaps to be filled. So this leads us, therefore, to conclude that there was a deficiency in orientation. We concluded that the main reason for what was missing in the collection was the very limited concept of the role and activity of a museum, which was held by the museum authority. To a large extent, and this is not surprising, the Barbados Museum up to that point was in the old tradition of European fine arts museums, whereas Kenneth Hudson reminds us, collections were formed by men and women who wished to display to others with the same taste and same level of knowledge as themselves to display to connoisseurs and to scholars. So in that tradition, even when the public was admitted to the museums remained exclusive and elitist, and were run naturally by small groups. And the visitors were admitted not as a right, but as a privilege. So while we could say that the museums fostered some scholarship, they were mainly storehouses of treasures. So our own museum had declared as early as 1944 that it was modern and that it also had an educational role. But by the 1970s and the 80s, it was clearly apparent that was far away from being an active factor in the cultural welfare and education of Barbadians. So how then, and this is the last stop. Oh, yes, this is the last stop. How then was the situation to be changed? The development plan recommended that at least 4 areas should be quickly developed. Taking the museums to the people through mobile exhibits, wide advertisement of its services through guided tours, regular exhibitions, and the reduction of the entrance charge, that there should be some supervision of cultural property. There should be conservation, and that conservation should be given a lot of attention, so a conservator should be appointed. And that, of course, there should be refocusing and development of the collection. So, and this is the main point, that it told the history of Barbados. Let me say a little bit about the last recommendation, because it's one of the key elements of a national museum in our circumstances. This could be broken down into natural history and general history. Natural history, as is obvious, would feature wildlife, the domestic animals, the vegetation, the geological structure. But the general history would feature as well, not as well, at least 15 exhibits set out in a sequence or themes to tell the story of man in Barbados. And we identify some 15 themes. And it was clear that these historians might add to those 15 themes. But you would expect to see or hear materials on Amerindians, settlement, the early sugar industry, the slave trade, slavery, Bridgetown, political development, the growth of Barbados, emancipation. These were some of the topics which in no coherent way we can see, and which, of course, if in fact it was a museum for the community, should, of course, be prominently displayed. So we wanted, therefore, that there should be clear sequencing and coherence. So the conversion, as you would expect, and clearly as the government was indicating, would be mainly funded by government, and such funding would enable the appointment of professional staff and also finance the various alterations which had been proposed. And we suggested too that the management of that conversion should be, of course, left to the museum, because collaboration was really the point of all of this as far as the government was concerned, should be left to the museum. And at that stage, the museum had a president in the imposing Jack Dare, who favored the conversion of the museum along the lines that the government was speaking. And therefore, clearly, to make that obvious and permanent, there would be 5 government appointed members on the council of the new society or museum. So we come to our final stop and ask the question, were the recommendations of the first development plan and those that followed fully implemented in the direction of establishing a national museum? I give a cautious yes to that question, indicating that we are still on the way. Let me say that I am aware that the cynically minded might be muttering, how can you expect significant change when the Barbados Museum and Historical Society gave us what we did, or what we had possessed up to, say, 1985. But yet, of course, you now say that these people should be left in charge of a conversion into a national museum. Is it not like saying that you will change so that you can get significant government funding, but of course that will permit you to continue more or less as you had been doing? In response, all I would say is this: the Barbados Museum and Historical Society must be constantly aware that several members of the public still associate the museum with elite groups and with elitist positions, so that I must work hard to rid some people of what we might term long-standing prejudices. My answer, however, is based, or I shouldn't say however, but therefore, is therefore based on what I have observed over the last 50 years. The Barbados Museum staff and council have moved with some dispatch to give us the themed exhibits that were recommended, that the first development plan recommended. It has generally removed exhibits of upper class home furnishing. It has an education officer who does good work with the schools. It organizes an annual lecture series. The bylaws of the societies have been updated, making membership a matter of paying dues and not an election which scrutinizes. And it also and the revision of the bylaws have excluded associate members. It also, that is the society, a new converted society, arranges frequent outings of a historical sort. It has a genealogical workshop, and it is a center for frequent social and cultural operations. And the journal, in its various articles, has now discovered, it had discovered a little bit earlier, it has discovered the people. So, my answer then remains cautious for two interconnected reasons. The first part is the fear that the Barbados Museum authorities and its council mainly might believe that the conversion is so complete that no further action needs to be taken. But as I shall indicate, the process must be an ongoing process. And given the museum's previous history and also the lingering doubts about the sincerity of its new mission, there must be continuous activity that demonstrates to the community that the museum has changed its character and function. The other part of my reservation is that there may be some areas where continual action must take place. I cite two of them. One is action to take the museum to the public or to the people by means of regular mobile displays and exhibitions. And this, for obvious reasons, is an essential feature of a national museum. The second area is the collections. All the exhibits, especially those relating to the history of Barbados, should be regularly scrutinized by staff so that they might be revised or extended. For example, what was put in place in the late 1980s must be in need of refurbishment and extension. And I draw attention to the following. By that I mean the collection should also pay attention to these. The landscape has been altered, the Barbadian landscape has been altered over the last 50 to 60 years with the partial disappearance of sugar plantations. We also have the spread of villages and now the residential subdivisions. We have the replacement of the major sugar, or what had been the major economic activity in sugar. We have that now replaced by tourism. We have, of course, the change from the village shop and the Bridgestone supplier to the supermarkets and the plazas. But most of all, we have emigration, which along with plantation culture has been the most defining element in our existence. And I don't just mean the immigration to the Carolinas in the 17th century. I mean that tide of immigration that went or took Barbadians to Trinidad, to Guyana, to Panama, to Cuba, to the United States, to Britain. What does the collection say about this movement and about its far-reaching effects? It's suspect, very, very little. So hopefully, by the time we celebrate the centenary of the museum and or the BMHS, the active minds inside the museum will have taken the action which I have hinted at, the action which will allay any doubts about the existence of a national museum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Woodville. That was a very incisive and very, well, an insider's account of the making of the plan for a national museum in Barbados, and with some quite provocative suggestions and questions right at the end, which I feel sure Ms. Cummins was listening to with very great care. Thank you so much for your lecture. I am going to check the Q&A, and there are no questions in the Q&A that I can see, but I just want to ask a quick question, which comes, I have no doubt, from ignorance. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a national museum and national art gallery. So I simply wanted to ask for my information. What happened to the art gallery bit? I should know. Does Barbados have a national gallery? Have they been divided up, as I know, for example, they have been in Bahamas? So in the Bahamas, this is my ignorance.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to answer your question. Alexandra Cummins is better qualified. I mean, we've been talking about the National Art Gallery as a separate operation for some time, and I think some space has been allocated for the National Art Gallery. Whether the National Art Gallery has come into existence yet, I cannot say, but certainly that is on the cards.
Yeah, to support Sir Woodville's statement, to answer your question, Bridget, the National Art Gallery Committee had been set up in the early 2000s and continued its operation until 2010. It came to an end in 2010 because government accepted and did put in place legislation to give effect to that aspiration for a national gallery. And then after that moment, it continued through appointed boards, including the one that I currently chair, to develop the program and develop the kinds of planning necessary to make a national gallery come into existence. But certainly, as Woodville pointed out, and I recall one statement, there was mention of the need fairly early on within the scope of the museum of a national gallery, but the activity around the development of a national gallery started to take effect from the late 80s with different interest groups. So there was no need for the museum to take on that role. The museum was happy to partner and to support that development of a separate institution.
Right, thank you. But is there currently a national art collection? And if so,
Yes.
where is it physically housed?
Okay, so there is a national art collection. I would say that the national art collection is kept carefully in storage on behalf of the National Art Gallery and on behalf of the Barbados Gallery of Art, which was a private group which had initiated the process of developing such institutions. But I should also note that the museum has been very faithfully following what is taking place there, because it anticipates that some of its own historical art collections will need to be borrowed on long-term loan then in order to flesh out the historical aspect of that artistic development. So I could say to you that amongst the National Art Gallery Committee, the National Collection, which is all of the pieces that have been acquired over centuries by government, the Barbados Museum Collection and the Barbados Gallery of Art, there are over 10,000 works that have potential to be displayed in the National Art Gallery once the building, which is actually next door to ours, is made, is updated, is renovated to proper standards, and then we're able to put in place the kinds of exhibits and programs that need to be there.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. In TNT, as you know, the art collection is housed in the top floor. It is not an ideal situation. The space is extremely limited, and TNT has art coming out of his ears. So it is really not satisfactory. Thank you. We have a question on the Q&A. I'm going to read it. It comes from Margaret Belgrave. She says, good afternoon. Apologies if this has already changed, but it always seemed to me that more West African information is required in the African Gallery. South Africa, she says, seems to be more dominant. Not sure if Woodville wants to answer that. Alessandra wants to answer. Woodville?
No, I don't know. I mean, that the type of detail, I know, no.
Well, I can answer. So, actually, this is one point where I would diverge a little bit from what Woodville said, because we had the opportunity in the 50s to acquire the Gilbert Carter collection of African pieces, and it was made very clear to the then Lady Gilbert Carter before her death that she didn't think that the Barbados Museum and Historical Society would be too interested in having that collection, and so she was perfectly prepared to make it available to newly formed museums, I think either in Nigeria or Ghana, I can't remember which. So we had the opportunity and didn't acquire that collection. In the meantime, what is on exhibit is not necessarily aimed towards Western or Southern Africa. Rather, what we attempted to do there was to make clear that we needed to see Africa as a continent before and not through the lens of slavery. Therefore, what we were looking at is to recognize the various civilizations and cultures and groups that formed African heritage, African identity, and we were not attempting in that space to define the characteristics of Barbadian the origins of Barbadian, African, Caribbean heritage in terms of what was on the exhibit. But having said that, the situation has been changing, and the collection is evolving, and we do look forward to updating a number of these exhibits when we redesign the main spaces at the Barbados Museum, because that is on the cards and it will be taking place in within the next 2 to 3 years. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Margaret, for that question. One thing that occurred to me when I listened to Woodville, the factors that you mentioned coming together in the post-independence period, which clearly led to the call for the conversion of the BMHS into a national museum. Do you think the appearance of the Caribbean Examinations Council was an important factor? I'm thinking of the CSEC syllabus, which came on board, wasn't it about 1979, 1980? And remember, it always from the beginning had an SBA component where the kids had to try and find little school-based projects. Would you think that CXC, it's CSEC, later it's Advanced Proficiency, the CAPE programs, do you think they were part of the cluster of factors which led to the call for a national museum?
Yes, well, yes, so thank you for that. It's something that has not occurred to me, but I think that is very likely that, for example, I don't recall now what the background to the CARICOM subcommittee was, or the CARICOM working group was. So it could well be that the CARICOM working group of the 1970s came out of all of that. I will have to go and do some digging in order to establish the connections between, in the general way, to find out what provoked this interest in moving towards a national museum anyhow, in a general sort of way, and also to consider what were the specifics, whether it was something like CXC. I don't know. I can't answer anymore.
Yes, it's sort of like a trinity, a call for a national museum, national examinations and syllabi, a national archives, a national trust, and there may be a national library, right? We have one thing that TNT does have is an extremely impressive national library building and operation. So
the National Cultural Foundation.
And right, we have a national, Barbados has a national cultural foundation. Yeah. I believe TNT did have, but to the best of my knowledge, it is not particularly functioning right now. So all of these institutions had to do with independence and self-identity, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but yes, but one would have to try to go into some detail and try and isolate, who was saying what or what was being said, and I'm afraid I have not done that, so I really can't do it. But I think that we will try and find a student to put a student on this.
Sorry, I was muted. One last question from me. You mentioned the intervention of government and the then Minister Nigel Barrow, which seems to have been quite significant. Are both your governing parties more or less on the same page when it comes to developments like the National Museum? I regret to say that is not the case in TNT, and I would be interested to know if there is substantial continuity as you throw out one government and bring in another party in their support for their policies about their thinking on National Museum and related issues.
Well, I think a very good question indeed. I would hesitate to point to any major differences between the two political parties on this issue. It could well be that says the DLP, which was the Party of Independence, didn't in fact take any action as far as I can see, but I will have to go back and check the newspapers on this point. They didn't take any action on it, but at the same time, one will recognize that people like Arbar, as I mentioned, was making statements. I mean, all like that. Royal Barbados Yacht Club had to drop the Royal because he insisted. So I would say that the attitude, the orientation of those people was in the same direction, but they were not, as far as I am aware, did not take any action. The second thing I would say is that when the other party, the BLP, took the action that I have just been talking about, in the 80s, particularly in the 80s, I mean, yeah, that might have come about because of what was happening on the regional front, not necessarily what was happening in Barbados. But the point is that succeeding governments have not moved away from that position, whether they were DLP or whether they were BLP. I don't think that I can't find any clear statements from DLP politicians ever since the 1980s, which lead in the direction of a national museum. But at the same time, they obviously were not doing anything to obstruct that movement that I've been talking about. I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, it does. Alessandra, do you want to add? You don't have to.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Woodville on this. The only statement that I can recall, I think it was a little bit before the developments here, was a statement by the then Minister of Education, yes, yes, and he made an interesting statement while at the reopening of the Shilston Memorial Library, that I think is quite redolent of a particular perspective and still in keeping with the direction that was going on. But as you said, there was not any major activity either for or against the museum's development,
Thank you. Well, it doesn't look that there are more questions on Q&A. No, there are not. So in that case, I think we shall wrap up this session. I think this was an excellent inaugural lecture for this series, and I learned a great deal from it, and I certainly will be tuning in to the subsequent lectures. Let me thank everybody who tuned in online or via Facebook, and I want to remind you that the next lecture is next week, same time. That's Wednesday, May the 3rd. The title is Development and Change, the Museum as a Function of its Society. And that will be delivered by Sir Trevor Carmichael, who is the current president of the BMHS. And as you know, lectures continue every Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. right up to the end of May, 31st May, which I think is Alessandra. So on all your behalf, let me thank Woodville, congratulate the BMHS and the Department of History for organizing this series, which I think promises to be really very interesting and very worthwhile. So signing off, thank you very much, everyone.